Welcome for all of you who've joined us from around the world to this webinar where we're exploring the issues of climate change and the importance of Indigenous knowledge. Anyone who follows the news about climate change and the conference COP28 taking part next month knows that climate change is hitting everyone everywhere with more powerful cyclonic storms, heat waves and forest fires, droughts and floods, crop failures and rising sea levels, all stronger and sooner than climate science had predicted. We are already seeing major human impacts, loss and damage. Scientists are warning that humid tropical areas may become uninhabitable as they become too hot. The climate crisis and associated sea level rise and ocean acidification represent a whole new level of risk to island states and communities. How do you face the future with realism while preserving the uniqueness that you have inherited from your ancestors? Tuvalu is loading its language and culture into the cloud as the only place safe from rising seas. One big challenge is the lack of any global legal protection for climate displaced persons, like the Refugee Convention for those who are persecuted. There should be provision for communities and even whole nations to change their physical location while preserving their language, culture, and social relationships. A drowned island state should retain its rights to its ocean resources and exclusive economic zone, which is not legally possible today. Now I would like to invite the first of our speakers from Canada, Nicole Redvers, who is a specialist on science and traditional science, to introduce this part of our dimension in the webinar today. Over to you, Nicole.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to go ahead and share screen. Bear with me for one moment here. My Indigenous way of being, my way of knowing and lived experience has really been informed by thousands of years of memories that have been stored in my region's stories. And stories are our main method, so to speak, rooted directly within the lands that we come from. And I really like how George KAICIID, an Indigenous elder, aptly describes this relationship by stating that the culture's vitality is literally dependent on individuals in community with the natural world. Indigenous cultures are an extension of the story of the natural community of a place and evolve according to ecological dynamics and natural relationships. Therefore, I must always honor my ancestors and my elders, as anything I share or talk about from my Indigenous way of being is not my knowledge, it's not my expertise, but a collective knowing of a group of people that stretches thousands of years in my region. Now, many Indigenous communities see our relationships being rooted in a framework of knowing that prizes interconnectedness at a fundamental base. And with ceremony being a critical action in acknowledging the reciprocity inherent within an interconnected worldview. Now, our worldview, or the lens of the world that we use, really affects how we see our innate hierarchy of ourselves over all of the beings on the planet, how we act, how we behave, and how we think of developing day-to-day projects, going from this ego I, this anthropocentric or human-centric, where humans are seen either implicitly or explicitly to be at the top of the hierarchy, comparatively to this we, this cosmocentric, ecocentric worldview, where humans are just one very small part of a larger system. Now, health equity considerations in practice are thankfully becoming more common in modern conversations and discourse. But what's also important, as denoted here on this slide, is an interspecies equity approach that is seen from a place of relationality and responsibility, because we are all interconnected with no hierarchy between us when it comes to how the natural systems operate in the world. Now, in many of our communities, we have fundamental basis of our what are sometimes called natural laws. In some communities, they may be original laws or first laws, or in my case, Dene laws. And sometimes I've heard them in other regions named by their own community of reference laws. And these natural or first laws, original laws, help to inform our Indigenous traditional knowledges, which of course then are applied through what we call traditional protocols, or almost like guidelines or rules, so to speak, for life. And those tend to inform our applications for how we see or apply our practices that give health to the ecosystems and the lands and waters around us, which of course results in a stewardship model that has healthy communities and ecosystems at its base. But the fundamental understanding is that we have what's called earth-centered jurisprudence systems, or earth-centered law systems, which govern both nature but also our global systems. There's this absolute unity of natural laws between us. You know, the sun will continue to set and rise in the same directions, the tide affecting the moons. These are things that we cannot change and automatically intertwine our laws with the laws of the earth. So in the vision for a healthy future, it's really important to create the conditions that enable this dissonance that often happens within Western beliefs, communities, and even scientific endeavors of this idea of being in nature, or going out in nature, going out for a walk, going out into the park, this nature that surrounds us, comparatively to what I've seen as many Indigenous beliefs, including my own community, that we are of nature. Nature embodies us. We can't separate ourselves given that interconnectedness.
Now I'd like to pass the floor over to Tafo Elusama.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, moderator, for the opportunity. I am originally from Tuvalu. I am currently looking after the Institute for Climate Indigenous Knowledge within the Pacific Theological College. There has not been a common agreed interpretation of what Indigenous knowledge is, and it has been interpreted in different ways at different places, but generally it is understood as local or traditional knowledge that Indigenous peoples have brought down with them from earlier times via the oral tradition. It has been highlighted by previous speakers that our Indigenous knowledge is orally transmitted, and they have different levels of this knowledge. There are open knowledge, which anyone can access. There are also closed knowledge that only a few can access. And there are sacred knowledge that it is hard to access, although it is not impossible. It is the accumulation of wisdom through years of trials and errors. It is not mine, it is not ours, it is wisdom and knowledge that have been passed down from generation to generation to generation. And as such, our relational understanding of life is that it is not confined to the present. It is inclusive of the past and the future. And it is also inclusive of the living, the ancestors, and the future generation. So when we speak about Indigenous knowledge, we are not speaking about the present only. We are speaking about our ancestors, the spirits of those who guide us daily. These Indigenous knowledges are underpinned by Indigenous philosophies. There are philosophies, and there are spiritualities and Indigenous sciences that underpins Indigenous knowledge. They are founded on relationality, the recognition of an interrelated and interconnected web of life.
Now we can go to our speaker, Elvira Rumkama, who's in the middle of the night in her part of the world in Papua, and is still able to share with us her dimensions as well of the Indigenous perspective. Over to you.
Thank you, Arthur. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy and grateful to be a part of this very important topic. I'm a lecturer, but also I'm an Indigenous female scholar and also an activist here in in Papua. When we talk about the indigenous people, we cannot see them as a one single identity. When we talk about indigenous people, we have to recognize that there are layers of identity inside the indigenous people. We talk about older generation or young generation, women, and also men. We talk about one particular privilege indigenous people inside that indigenous people. So I think it's important to recognize that there is indigenous people themselves cannot see as one single identity because there are layers of identity inside. And also from our findings that will be my talking point is that when we talk about traditional or we talk about the indigenous knowledge, we have to recognize, at least in the context of Papua, that traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge also changes. When we talk about the traditional indigenous knowledge, as an indigenous scholar or indigenous female activist, I also believe that it's important to maintain the traditional knowledge because the existence of the indigenous people have been for 100 years. And when I think about it, I believe that if they can survive amid so many changes, structural changes, influx of migration, change in the economic system, the presence of corporation, the presence of churches, ecological changes, I believe there must be because of the strength that they have, and it must be because of their traditional knowledge. It must be because of their philosophy that they have. But so it's important, of course, to maintain this traditional knowledge because that is their strength. In the case of this indigenous people in Iwat village that we went there, their land have been taken by the corporation through a very manipulative ways, and the state do nothing about it. But at the same time, they have to against the corporation, but also they have to mitigate the changes because of the environmental changes due to the climate change. So well, we talk about the indigenous knowledge, we talk about the ownership with the land, with the forest, but when your land have been taken in the name of the development project, then you only have indigenous people, indigenous knowledge. The question is, how can we maintain that indigenous knowledge in the context of so many structural challenges that take place at the same time.
A couple of years ago, we had many Indigenous community members, land defenders, elders, knowledge holders gather from around the world to come together in a process to determine what we thought was the determinants of planetary health, which basically is, what are the elements, the things that makes Mother Earth well? What are the things that impact her well-being? Because we often center what makes humans well, sometimes less commonly what makes animals well, but not necessarily putting Mother Earth in the center of that process. And we came up with a number of determinants of planetary health. And I just want to highlight one here specifically, which bridges off the comments that I had made on the interconnectedness with water and some of the fundamental acknowledgements of us being in and of itself nature. And that is the human interconnectedness with nature determinant. And we stated very specifically that ecological demise, or the destruction of Earth, points to an impaired human relationship with its inner self, because humans are nature and not apart from it. So in the broader sense of the world, there's evidence of the loss of an ecologically bound cultural identity. And this disconnect from nature manifests itself as a fragmented and dissociated identity that cannot recognize itself as part of a greater system. And when you can't recognize yourself as a greater system, as a part of a greater system, it makes it easier to project predatory and abusive impulses onto the environment. So this ideology of independence has resulted in a sense of entitled ownership over lands and waters, this perception of the natural world that relates to it through transactional relationships that do not have a sense of responsibility, care, or love. And this worldview will only continue to perpetuate planetary harm.
Now we'd like to hear from George Carter, who's our specialist on climate science from Indigenous perspective, and is knowledgeable of the Pacific Islands perspective as well. So over to you, George.
My name is George Carter, or Salah George Carter. Although I'm based in Canberra, Australia, at the moment I'm currently in Samoa, where we are undertaking the preparatory work for Pacific Island state negotiators in preparation for COP28. Main agenda within the COP is situated within the mitigation, which predominantly focuses on economies and the way in which we try to not only stabilize, but hopefully push countries to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, and as well as looking at areas of just transitions. The other area is within adaptation. And for the past 35 years within the regime, this is where Pacific Island countries have articulated or pursued the need for more attention on Indigenous knowledge, that the mechanisms within the UNFCCC, such as funding mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, pay more attention or give more resources to Indigenous knowledge, and how this and how knowledge of the land, or continuation knowledge of the continuing knowledge of the land, can help and have helped Pacific communities, and as well as inform national policies within the Pacific to adapt. Now, we've even heard this again over and over, and in last year's IPCC report, in terms of the report around adaptation, it articulated and even emphasized this call that Pacific Island countries have been saying, that we need more evidence, we need more research, and we need more attention focusing on traditional knowledge from Indigenous peoples, and how these practices and customs have informed and can continue to inform to provide not only solutions to adaptation, but also in the space where we are now acutely, where we now hear more and more states and also activism moving towards in terms of climate justice, where Indigenous practices and Indigenous institutions can help in terms of the, what, lack of a better word, tough situations like mobility or immobility, and how Indigenous and traditional institutions can help people work through and create dialogue, spaces for dialogue that are culturally sensitive, but also bring in the spirituality into these spaces, that are not just about solutions to adaptation, but also in the more situations in terms of mobility because of climate impacts.
The Institute aims to provide an alternative to how things have been understood and interpreted for us in the region. And that alternative is using Indigenous knowledge as our main lens and framework to frame how we approach climate change. The underpinning philosophy of this project is relationality, the space, or the sacred space of the va, that determines how we relate to the other. It connects and disconnects God, creation, and human. Within relationality, the existence of creation, humans, and God are all found within that relationality. Our Indigenous communities have their own methods of food preservations. They differ from community to community. And it has sustained our communities for centuries. These Indigenous philosophies and frameworks needs to be the frames that frames any intervention into the local people's livelihood. if the climate narrative and the efforts by UNFCCC and the UN to make any progress in the positive direction, then we need to take into serious consideration the importance of indigenous climate knowledge.
Based on our research and based on my reflection as well, I think it's important to document the traditional knowledge, values, and practicing. I think that is an initial thing to do, especially in the context like in the situation in West Papua, where our culture have been denied, do not really integrate in the policy changes, even not even in recognized by the government or the policy agenda. So it's important to document the traditional knowledge, values, and practices, including, I believe it's important to assess what have changes. What are the knowledge that have changes, why it changes, how do we maintain, or how do you reclaim that our power back, our traditional knowledge. Secondly, I think my reflection also bring me to think about it's important also to assessing and documenting the strength of the indigenous people. And third, I think also it's important to linking the climate change into the indigenous people realities. So in the case of the IF20 indigenous people in our IF20 village, the place that we went there, the climate change as a issue is not really understood by the indigenous people. What I mean is we do not really use the terminology climate change is too abstract. The indigenous people, they know there are changes, but they do not put any name on them. And then we come up and say, this is the climate change. So we have to like try to connect the realities of the indigenous people with the definition that we bring about the climate change. And that's how we can talk about how to strengthen the advocacy on every level. And also, I think it's important to establish a link between indigenous and science or technology. We believe about the indigenous knowledge, but also I believe it's important to establish a link with the science or technology. And my point also, it's also important to expose the linkages between climate change, environmental degradation, racism, global capitalism, and social injustice before implementing it in disaster mitigation. And rejecting the exploitative development project, because I think so many things that have to be borne by the indigenous people, climate change, but also structural problems that really threaten their survival and their sustainable livelihood. And of course, the most important thing is adopt the mitigation strategy into the policies.
A conversation that is very sensitive here in the Pacific, as some of you are aware, in terms of countries like Vanuatu and Fiji have already started planning of relocation of communities, especially those at coastal or riverside communities that need to move a little bit inland. And despite the fact there have been hundreds of communities identified to move within their own customary lands, it's still very sensitive and a very hard process. And it's not just about the physical relocation of community, it's a relocation of spiritual, ancestral, cultural practices. Now, some of the research that's carried out at the moment is with communities that have been relocated, they have struggled with cohesion because of the loss of cultural practices, whereby in some areas in Tonga, where communities were had fishing communities with fishing houses for men. These houses that no longer exist within the innerlands where the new locations. And so there's a loss of cohesion within the community because these traditional indigenous structures cannot be replicated or become practice again. Now, we identify this as loss of culture, and this is something that we clearly want to present forth in the case of the loss of practice, loss of culture in non-economic under the umbrella of loss and damage. So where can we see integration? I mean, why do we need to research and more attention on indigenous and local traditional knowledge. It's not just about adaptation, it's also about the fact of, in the case of loss and damage. What can we do in terms of why is this fundamental for the Pacific? As you know, many of Pacific Island countries, 90, I think the percentage is about 98% of the population are rural and are still indigenous. And so for many communities in the Pacific, everything, the worldview, the way we live in is still indigenous. But what is happening is there's more attention focused on development practices of outside pursued by partners, but there's less attention of supports in supporting indigenous structures that are already in the villages or already in the provinces, or support for the practices that are currently undertaken. And that's something that we also try to pursue within these negotiations is don't just invest in technology or capacities that's being introduced, but please focus on what's already in there. That's survived the tens of thousands of years.
With the increasing climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, pollution crisis, there's been a favorable and an important increase in acknowledgement of Indigenous traditional knowledges. However, what's been often occurring is that the narrative is focused on Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous knowledges alone, without the consequent recognition that Indigenous knowledges don't come without Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights and Indigenous lands. So I often am forced to clarify that narrative, that it's not about learning from, extracting from Indigenous knowledges. It's about working collaboratively with Indigenous peoples who happen to hold vast amounts of Indigenous knowledges from around the world, using a distinctions-based approach, which is very much in coming with one of the other speakers, that there's a heterogeneity. See, it's too late, I can't speak anymore. A diversity of Indigenous peoples around the world that have very different traditional ecological knowledges. So this idea of scale up, which continues to be pushed in many circles around Indigenous knowledges, is very much lost and disconnected from the context-based Indigenous scientific approach that we've had for thousands of years, where the knowledges on the islands are very different from my knowledges in the Arctic, which are very different from the knowledges in the desert to our Southwest partners, that it's not a scale up of one form, but a contextual quilt that's patched in around the world of a holistic way of seeing our stewardship practices.
One of the areas that needs to be taken into consideration is that when we talk about climate change and Indigenous knowledge, it is situational. One size do not fit all. So the question of how we can integrate Indigenous climate knowledge into the global science in our search for solutions have to be contextual. We cannot use one context to formulate solutions for all contexts when it comes to Indigenous knowledge. We are quite aware that our young people have been disconnected from their communities from early ages when they are moved out of their villages into urban centers for education purposes, and then they stay for employment. So this connection between our young people and the actual way of life that their communities live and the relational way of life the communities operate on needs to be filled in. So we have programs put in place where we will reintroduce young people to their communities, to re-educate them by their own elders, by the experts, and to observe, so that when they talk about the issue of climate change, they are not talking about abstracts. They talk, or they will be speaking from the reality of the experiences and how they live in the villages.
I want to respond specifically on the question of the explicit permission from the Indigenous people when the government, allowed the corporation come to to indigenous people land. In context of West Papua, what happened is that we have, when it comes to the national strategic development project, then it means that it is the priority. So the government just go, and then they can like just release the permit for the corporation without doing the consultation, even though that internationally there should be like the free prior informed consent from the indigenous people. But what happened was there always agreement between the corporation and the government to just release the permit without talking or consulting with the indigenous people. And I believe that racism is also one of the factors that make the government do not want to like involve the indigenous people in this very important development project. But the second thing also, that the indigenous people in West Papua, usually they seems like they could not really resist, because the government used the military, the force, police or the military force to make the indigenous people quiet, so they cannot do like anything when they face the corporation. And because of the ongoing conflict and the very long context of conflict in West Papua, indigenous West Papuan, they have like intergenerational trauma. So when they face the military or police, I mean, it's a huge problem. It's really hard for them to like resist against the police or the military force. That's how so many corporations now in West Papua to do exploitation, and that's how it threatens the survival of indigenous people.